Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that honestly sounds almost too good to be true.
Mm-hmm.
Could enjoying something like chocolate actually be linked to a lower risk of heart failure?
It's definitely a topic that grabs your attention, doesn't it? And yeah, researchers have been looking into it. For this deep dive, we're really digging into a specific piece of research.
Okay.
It's a recent meta-analysis published in the journal Nutrients.
Right, a meta-analysis. So pulling together results from multiple studies to try and get a clearer picture.
Exactly. Because sometimes individual studies can, give conflicting results.
So our mission today is to unpack what this research says about chocolate and heart failure risk, what the key findings really are, and maybe what it could mean for you, the listener.
Sounds good. And maybe first, just a quick refresher on heart failure. It's an important context.
Good idea.
Yeah, so it's not like a heart attack, which is sudden. Heart failure is more of a chronic condition. It's complex. Basically, the heart muscle weakens and can't pump blood effectively enough for the body's needs.
Which leads to symptoms like shortness of breath, fatigue.
Exactly. Shortness of breath, fatigue, swelling in the legs. It affects millions worldwide. It's a huge health burden. So finding ways to prevent it or lower the risk is really, really important.
Absolutely. And, this idea linking chocolate, or maybe more specifically cocoa, to heart health isn't entirely new, is it?
No, definitely not. There have been quite a few studies over the years suggesting potential cardiovascular benefits.
Like what kind of benefits?
Well, things like potentially helping to lower blood pressure. And high blood pressure is, of course, a major risk factor for heart failure itself.
Right, because it puts extra strain on the heart over time. Makes sense.
Precisely. And other research has hinted at maybe lower rates of heart attacks or strokes, potentially better blood vessel function, even lower cardiovascular mortality overall.
Okay, so a range of potential heart benefits.
Yeah.
But the question here is specifically about preventing heart failure, new cases popping up.
Exactly. And that's where things were a bit murky before this meta-analysis. Studies looking just at chocolate intake and the risk of developing heart failure over time, what we call incident heart failure, they had inconsistent results.
Ah, okay. Some suggested a link, others didn't find one.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
It was unclear, which is precisely why this meta-analysis is useful. They wanted to pool all that data together.
To see if a clearer pattern emerged.
Yes, and crucially, they also wanted to look at the amount of chocolate. Does how much you eat matter? That whole dose-response question.
Okay, so how did they actually go about this? What was the process?
Well, they did a systematic search of the big medical databases. They were looking specifically for prospective studies.
Meaning studies that follow people forward in time.
Exactly. They enroll a large group of people, assess their habits like chocolate consumption at the start, and then follow them for years to see who eventually develops heart failure. It's a stronger design for looking at risk factors compared to, say, asking people who already have heart failure about their past diet.
Got it. So they needed studies that measured chocolate intake, tracked new heart failure cases, and reported the risk mathematically, like using hazard ratios.
Right. Those were the key inclusion criteria. After sifting through the literature, they landed on 5 large prospective studies that fit the bill.
5 studies? That might not sound like a huge number initially.
It doesn't, but the total number of people involved was massive. Across those 5 studies, we're talking over 106,000 participants.
Wow, okay. That's a lot of data points.
It is. And during the follow-up periods, which were quite long, ranging from about 9 to 14 years, there were 4,832 new cases of heart failure identified.
And where were these studies conducted? Who were the participants?
They were primarily from Europe and the USA.
Okay. And how did they figure out how much chocolate people were eating? Was that standardized?
Mostly through food frequency questionnaires, or FFQs. It's a pretty standard tool in nutrition research. You ask people how often, on average, they consumed various foods over the past year or so.
Right. Not perfect, relies on memory, but common for large-scale studies.
Exactly. And to combine the data across studies, the meta-analysis authors standardized the consumption into servings per week. They estimated one serving to be about 50 grams of chocolate.
50 grams? Like a standard chocolate bar, roughly.
Yeah, roughly in that ballpark, depending on the bar. And importantly, they also checked the quality of the studies they included.
How did they do that?
They used a common tool called the Newcastle-Ottawa scale, the NS score. It basically rates how well a study was designed and carried out, looking at things that could introduce bias.
And how did these studies fare?
They scored really well, actually. The
Oh,
average score was 8.8 out of a possible 9, suggesting they were generally considered high-quality studies.
okay, so high quality data, lots of participants, long follow-up. Let's get to the juicy part.
Right.
What did they find? What's the link?
Well, probably the most striking finding, as we touched on, was the shape of the relationship. It wasn't linear.
Not just more chocolate, lower risk, or more chocolate, higher risk.
No. They found what they described as a curve-linear relationship. Specifically, it looked like a J shape.
A J shape. Okay, paint a picture for us. What does that mean in terms of risk?
Okay, imagine a graph. Along the bottom, you have chocolate consumption, starting from 0 servings per week and increasing. Up the side, you have the risk of developing heart failure compared to people who eat no chocolate.
Got it.
The line starts at the baseline risk for non-consumers. Then, as you move along to low or moderate consumption, the line goes down. Risk decreases.
Lower risk with some chocolate. Okay.
But then, after hitting a low point, the curve starts to bend back upwards as consumption increases further.
So the benefit starts to disappear or even reverse at higher levels.
That's exactly what the J shape implies. The lowest risk, the bottom of the J, seemed to occur around 3 servings per week.
3 servings a week, that was the sweet spot.
Apparently so, in this analysis. Compared to eating no chocolate, consuming around 3 servings per week was associated with about a 14% lower risk of heart failure. And the statistics suggested this wasn't just a chance finding.
Oh, 14% lower risk at 3 servings. Interesting. So what happened on the other side of that dip as people ate, say, 7 servings a week or more?
Well, the risk started climbing back up that J curve. When they specifically looked at high consumption, defined as 7 or more servings per week, they found no statistically significant lower risk compared to non-consumers.
So the benefit seen at moderate levels essentially vanished.
It vanished, statistically speaking, yes. The hazard ratio was close to 1.0, meaning basically no difference in risk compared to 0 intake.
And if you went even higher, like 10 servings a week?
At 10 servings per week, the calculated risk estimate actually nudged slightly above the risk for non-consumers, suggesting potential harm, although this specific point estimate for increased risk wasn't statistically significant in the overall analysis. But the trend is clear. The benefit disappears, and the curve heads upwards at very high intakes.
That J-shape is really the key takeaway then. More isn't better. Moderation seems key here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they confirmed this by looking at broader categories, too. When they compared everyone eating low to moderate amounts less than 7 servings a week to non-consumers, they saw that significant 14% lower risk.
Okay.
But when they compared the high consumers, 7 or more servings a week, to non-consumers, that significant benefit was gone. It really reinforces the J-shaped finding.
Fascinating. So why? What could be driving this? What's in chocolate that might help at moderate levels? And what changes the equation at high levels?
Right, the why. On the potential benefit side, the main candidates are compounds called flavonoids.
Ah, yes, flavonoids. I've heard about those. They're antioxidants.
They are a type of polyphenol with antioxidant properties, yes.
Yeah.
And cocoa is particularly rich in certain types of flavonoids. Research suggests they might have several positive effects on the cardiovascular system.
Like what we mentioned blood pressure earlier.
Exactly. They might help lower blood pressure, possibly by acting in ways similar to some blood pressure medications, like ACE inhibitors, helping relax blood vessels. They might also help improve cholesterol levels, maybe boosting HDL, the good cholesterol, and reduce inflammation, which is involved in many chronic diseases, including heart problems.
So hitting multiple pathways that could protect the heart.
Potentially, yes. There's also evidence they improve endothelial function.
The lining of the blood vessels.
Yes, the endothelium is critical for blood vessel health. Flavonoids might help it function better, possibly by boosting nitric oxide production, which helps keep vessels flexible. All these potential mechanisms could explain why we see that dip in risk, the downward part of the J at those lower, moderate consumption levels.
All right, that makes sense for the potential upside. But then what about the other side of the J? Why does the benefit seem to disappear or even reverse when people eat a lot of chocolate?
Yeah, this is where the reality of commercial chocolate comes in. We're not usually talking about pure, unsweetened cocoa powder here.
Right. We're talking chocolate bars, candies, often high in sugar and fat.
Exactly. Commercially available chocolate is often very energy-dense, high in calories, often high in added sugars, and sometimes high in saturated fats, depending on the type.
So the downside kicks in.
That seems to be the most plausible explanation. Eating large amounts of chocolate regularly means taking in a lot of extra calories. And we know very clearly that significant weight gain, becoming overweight or obese, is a major established risk factor for developing heart failure.
So the sheer calorie load at high intakes could simply overwhelm any potential benefits from the flavonoids.
That's the leading theory. It's a trade-off. The beneficial compounds are still there, but they're packaged with a lot of calories, sugar, and fat. It's also possible that if someone's eating, say, 10 chocolate bars a week, they might be displacing healthier foods from their diet.
Like eating less fruit, vegetables, whole grains?
Potentially, yeah. So it could be a double whammy, adding less healthy components and reducing intake of protective ones. This balance or imbalance between the good stuff, flavonoids, and the less good stuff, calories, sugar, fat, likely explains why that J-shaped curve emerges in the overall population.
It really highlights that context matters. The chocolate isn't eaten in isolation.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of context, we need to talk limitations, right? Every study has them, especially meta-analyses of observational data.
Oh, definitely. It's crucial to be aware of the caveats. For starters, as we mentioned, this finding of a J-shaped benefit actually contradicts an earlier meta-analysis on the same topic, which didn't find a significant association overall.
Why the difference, do we think?
The authors of this newer paper suggest it might be because they specifically did that detailed dose-response analysis. Looking at the risk across the whole range of intake allowed them to pick up that J-shape.
Whereas the older one might have just compared, say, the highest versus the lowest intake groups.
Possibly, yeah. And if you just compare the highest to the lowest, you might average out or miss the benefit that seems concentrated in that moderate zone. So the methodology matters.
Okay, that makes sense. What are the other big limitations here?
Well, the absolute biggest one is inherent to the type of studies included. They're observational, they track people and see what happens, but they can't definitively prove cause and effect.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. So while we see an association moderate chocolate eaters had a lower observed risk, we can't say for sure that the chocolate caused the lower risk. There could be other factors, what we call confounders, at play.
Like maybe people who eat moderate amounts of chocolate also happen to have other healthier habits. Maybe they exercise more or eat better overall diets or have higher incomes.
Precisely. The original studies try to statistically adjust for known factors like age, smoking, exercise, maybe overall diet quality. But it's impossible to perfectly measure and account for everything. There could be residual confounding.
And what about measuring the chocolate intake itself? You mentioned FFQs.
Yeah. Food frequency questionnaires rely on people accurately recalling their diet over a long period, which can be tricky. There's potential for recall bias. And then there's the chocolate itself.
Ah, right. Did they look at different types of chocolate? Dark versus milk?
Unfortunately, no. The meta-analysis couldn't dig down to that level based on the data reported in the original studies. We generally think dark chocolate, with its higher flavonoid and lower sugar content, might be more beneficial.
But this study couldn't confirm that specifically for heart failure risk?
No, it looked at total chocolate consumption. So we don't know from this analysis if the type matters for this specific outcome, though biologically it seems plausible. They also couldn't fully tease out the interaction with total calorie intake in the pooled data, even though, as we discussed, it's likely a huge factor in that J-shape.
Okay. And the participants were mainly from Western countries?
Yes, Europe and the USA. So whether these findings apply to populations in Asia, Africa, or other parts of the world with different baseline diets and genetics, we can't assume that. It needs more research in diverse populations.
Any other key caveats?
Well, there's the fact these studies track incident heart failure, but they don't tell us about the timeline. Does moderate chocolate consumption delay the onset or truly prevent it long-term? We don't know. And one more complex point the authors mentioned is something called competing risks. Especially in older populations, people are at risk of dying from various causes. Someone might be on track to develop heart failure but die from cancer or a stroke first.
So that other cause of death competes with heart failure.
Right. And the original studies, and thus this meta-analysis, didn't specifically account for this competing risk of mortality, which can sometimes complicate the interpretation of risk estimates for specific diseases in older groups.
Okay, that adds another layer of caution.
It does. It's just something to keep in the back of your mind when looking at these kinds of long-term observational studies.
All right, so bearing all those limitations in mind, let's try to synthesize this. What's the main takeaway message from this deep dive into this particular meta-analysis?
I think the clearest message is that moderate chocolate consumption, specifically around that level of maybe 3 servings per week, appears to be associated with a lower risk of developing heart failure compared to eating none.
Okay. An association with moderation.
But crucially, this benefit seems to follow that J-shaped curve. The association disappears, or potentially even reverses, at high levels of consumption. More is definitely not better here, likely because the detrimental effects of excess calories, sugar, and fat start to outweigh any potential flavonoid benefits.
And we absolutely have to stress again. This is an association found in observational studies. It's not proof of cause and effect. It's certainly not a medical recommendation to start eating chocolate if you don't already, or to eat lots of it, especially given the calories.
Absolutely not. It's not a prescription for chocolate. But it does provide a more detailed, more nuanced picture of this potential relationship than perhaps we had before, really underscoring that the amount consumed might be critical.
It adds an interesting piece to the puzzle, which I think leads us nicely to a final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder.
Okay.
Given this J-shaped curve, the clear impact of calories and other components of chocolate, and all the limitations like potential confounding, what does moderate chocolate consumption really signify in the grand scheme of a healthy life? Is it possible that the chocolate itself is conferring a small benefit? Or could it be that people who manage to eat just a moderate amount of a treat like chocolate are maybe also exhibiting moderation and healthier patterns in other areas of their lives that these studies couldn't fully capture? What other unseen factors might be influencing this link?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is it the chocolate or the person eating the chocolate in that moderate way?
Something to definitely chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure. Always interesting stuff.